He looked at her like she didn't belong there. No degree, no agency credentials. Just a navy uniform, yellow gloves, and a quiet confidence he didn't trust. Richard Oliver, billionaire, widower, father to twin boys who hadn't spoken in weeks, glanced at her resume, one-page, creased, handwritten references. "Thanks for coming," he said. "We'll let you know." She turned to leave. Then he saw the boys, watching her. Still, for the first time in weeks, not afraid. "Wait," he said. "Come in." And just like that, the woman he almost turned away became the one who changed everything. Boston, Beacon Hill, the kind of winter morning that presses silence into the air. Florence Martin stepped off the city bus with no suitcase, no driver waiting, just a folded reference letter and a worn leather journal tucked under one arm. At the mansion gates, the butler barely nodded. The house manager took one look at her and frowned. Inside, it was colder than the air outside. Not just quiet, but heavy, the kind of stillness that follows loss. Portraits of a smiling family lined the halls, but the smiles had long faded from this house. Richard didn't look at her twice. His office smelled like burnt coffee and deadlines. "You're the applicant?" She nodded. He scanned her resume. Paused. Behind him, from the top of the stairs, two small faces, Boris and Brian, 5 years old, watching through the banister. Eyes too tired for their age. Richard muttered the words he'd said 9 times before. "We'll let you know." Florence turned to leave, but the boys didn't. They just looked at her, not blinking, not afraid. And that's when something shifted. Richard saw it, felt it, and for the first time in months, he hesitated. "Wait," he said. "Come in." Florence didn't smile, didn't thank him. She just nodded and stepped into a house that had forgotten what warmth felt like. That night she didn't unpack much. No framed photos, no perfumes, just a storybook and a single candle. She sat on the floor of the guest room, reading aloud to no one, until the boys wandered in, barefoot, wordless. They didn't sit beside her, but they didn't leave. By bedtime, they were asleep. No tears, no resistance, just rest. Richard passed the open door and stopped. Both sons, silent, still, safe. And the woman beside them, the one he nearly sent away. She hadn't done anything extraordinary. She'd simply been there, present, unshaken, listening to the quiet like it meant something. And for the first time in 91 days. The house exhaled. Click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story reminds you that sometimes the person we almost overlook is the one who sees what no one else can. The front door closed behind her with a sound too soft for a house this large. Florence stood in the marble foyer, coat still buttoned, gloves still on, not moving. Not yet. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick. A waiting kind of silence. A voice broke it. "We've had 9 before you," said Greta, the house manager. Her heels echoed across the tile like punctuation marks. "Don't try to impress. Just don't make it worse." Florence nodded once, neither defensive nor eager. Greta handed her a paper with tight, typewritten rules, curfews, mealtimes, forbidden rooms. She pointed toward the West Wing. "That's where the staff stays. The children don't like being touched or spoken to unless they speak first." Florence took the paper, but didn't glance at it. The boys were watching again, still peeking through the staircase rails, not hiding, not coming closer. Florence didn't wave. Instead, she stepped out of her shoes at the edge of the carpet, quietly, as if not to disturb something sacred. Then she crossed to the kitchen, gloves still on, and began slicing apples. Slow, deliberate, no rush. Each slice fanned onto a plate like she was offering something more than fruit, like she was building trust out of skin and seeds. She placed the plate at the far end of the kitchen table and sat down in silence, not facing the hallway, just waiting. A few minutes passed. Then 2 small feet appeared in the doorway. Pajamas, no socks. A stuffed rabbit clutched under one arm. Brian stepped inside. No words, just stillness. He glanced at the apple slices, then at Florence. She didn't speak, didn't smile wide. She just moved the plate an inch closer, slow enough to be permission, not invitation. He took one. Behind him, Boris appeared, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. But he didn't leave. He just leaned against the doorframe like a sentry. Greta watched from down the hall, arms folded, her voice low, almost bitter. "They never come in this early." Florence didn't answer. She folded the apple peels into a neat spiral and placed them gently into the compost bin. The clock ticked. Nothing rushed. No bright voices. No declarations of, "We're going to have so much fun," like the last woman had said, right before she left crying on day 3. Florence poured a glass of water, drank half, placed it down with quiet hands. Brian tugged at his brother's sleeve, whispered something. Boris didn't answer, but he didn't pull away either. That was enough. Later that evening, as Greta laid out the linen napkins and adjusted the silverware with mechanical precision, she muttered under her breath, "It's always quiet at first, they all think they're the one." Florence didn't correct her, because she wasn't here to be the one. She was here because of a promise. And promises don't need applause. They just need to be kept. Upstairs, the boys sat cross-legged at the edge of their shared bed, the stuffed rabbit tucked between them. They waited, not for a story, not for a song, but for the sound of someone who wouldn't fill the silence, just keep it safe. Florence's footsteps moved softly down the hallway, slow, even, familiar, and as she reached for the doorknob, one of them whispered her name. The door creaked open. Florence didn't say a word. She stepped inside the boys' bedroom like someone entering a sanctuary, not a space to manage, but one to respect. Boris was already under the covers, pretending to sleep. Brian sat upright, the stuffed rabbit in his lap, eyes flicking toward her, then back down. Florence didn't ask if they brushed their teeth, didn't mention pajamas. She sat on the edge of the carpet, crossed her legs, and opened the same tattered storybook she'd unpacked the night before. She didn't read aloud, not yet. She waited, gave the room time to breathe. Then, slowly, she began. Soft voice, steady rhythm, not at them, not for them, just into the room. Halfway through the first page, Brian slid down from the bed and padded across the floor to sit beside her. Close, but not touching. When she turned the page, he leaned in, just slightly, enough to see the next illustration. Still, no words. But something deeper than words was happening. Florence rose before the sun. The next morning, she was already in the kitchen when Greta came in. No music, no chatter, just the quiet click of a knife slicing through apples. Florence peeled each one slowly, letting the spirals fall into a ceramic bowl like silk ribbons. Then she reached for a second plate, sliced them thinner this time, delicate half-moons, arranged like a fan. Greta watched from the doorway. "You really think slicing fruit is going to fix what 9 trained nannies couldn't?" Florence didn't look up. "Kids notice what no one teaches them to." Greta raised an eyebrow. "Meaning?" Florence placed the fan of apples on the boy's plate. "Meaning how you do something tells them how you feel about them." Greta didn't reply, but she didn't leave either. The twins entered the kitchen in silence. No words, no eye contact. But they came. Together. Brian reached for an apple slice. Boris didn't touch his, but he sat. That was new. Florence didn't break the moment with questions or praise. She just moved to the sink, rinsed her hands, dried them slowly, and returned to her seat. No commands, no coaxing, only presence. Across the room, Greta folded a towel harder than necessary. "They're testing you. Don't mistake silence for progress." Florence turned slightly, eyes calm. "Silence is progress." She said it without ego, without challenge. As if she knew something Greta didn't. Later that day, Florence found a crumpled drawing tucked behind the toaster, thick crayon lines, 2 small figures beneath a giant sun with no face. She smoothed it out with care, then folded it once, just once, and slid it into her pocket like it was something sacred. She didn't ask who drew it, didn't mention it at dinner, Didn't show it off. Some things don't need spotlight. Only safekeeping. That night after lights out, she passed by the boys' room. The door was cracked, just enough. Inside she heard breathing, even, gentle. Then, a whisper, not to her, to each other. Just one word, shared between brothers in the dark. Florence didn't step in, didn't interrupt. She kept walking, hands in her pockets, fingers curled softly around the folded paper. Because silence had rules. And tonight, the boys had just rewritten one of them. The storm came in soft, not thunder, just wind, brushing against the windows like a memory trying to get in. It was just after midnight when Florence heard the hallway floor creak. Bare feet, small steps. She didn't turn on the light, didn't call out. She waited. Brian appeared first, clutching the stuffed rabbit by its ear, pajama shirt twisted from sleep. Behind him, Boris, silent, but not afraid. They weren't going to the bathroom. They were standing in front of a closed door. The master bedroom, the one Richard had kept locked since the funeral. Florence stepped out of her room, slow and soft. She crouched beside them. "Do you want me to open it?" Neither boy answered, but Brian nodded, barely. Florence didn't reach for the knob. She waited. Brian pressed his forehead against the wood, whispered something she couldn't make out. Then he looked up, so she opened the door. The room hadn't changed. The bed was still made the same way Amanda left it, a scarf still draped over the mirror. Her perfume, untouched on the dresser, faint but present, like a ghost still deciding whether to leave. Brian crossed the threshold first. No rush, no words. They sat on the edge of the bed, small, still, as if listening for something only they could hear. Florence stood at the door, waiting. Then she stepped inside, only because Brian reached for her hand. She didn't turn on the overhead light, just the lamp beside the bed. It cast a warm glow over the pillows. The shadows softened. Brian leaned into her shoulder. Boris curled at the foot of the bed. Florence sat between them, still in her uniform, her hands folded in her lap. They didn't cry. They just breathed. Together. Like the silence had finally given them permission. She didn't mean to fall asleep. But when she opened her eyes, morning light was leaking through the curtains. Brian was in her lap. Boris beside her. Both boys fast asleep. She stayed still, not wanting to wake them. The bedroom door creaked. Florence turned. Richard stood there, frozen. No words, no anger, just a man staring at something he hadn't allowed himself to see in months. His sons, sleeping. In the bed he couldn't face. With a woman he nearly turned away. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. His eyes landed on the scarf hanging from the mirror. Amanda's. Still there. Florence didn't speak. She just held Brian a little closer, hand resting gently on his back. Richard stepped forward, one pace, then another, and stopped. His breath caught in his chest, and for the first time in 16 months, he wept. Not loud, not broken, just the quiet kind of crying that happens when the dam cracks and lets light back in. Florence didn't look at him. She stayed where she was, still, present, steady, because that bed wasn't just where grief lived, it was where healing had finally dared to sit down. That afternoon, the house was quieter than usual, not heavy, not hollow, just softer. Florence stood in the boys' room with a book in her hand, one she hadn't seen before. It wasn't part of the usual shelf. Its spine was faded, cloth-bound, with a pressed flower tucked between the pages. She didn't ask where it came from, but she knew who it belonged to. Amanda's name was written inside the cover, a looping, delicate signature. Florence sat on the floor, cross-legged, the book resting in her lap. She didn't call the boys in, didn't announce story time. She just opened the book and began to read. Her voice was quiet, not for dramatic effect, not for attention, just gentle. The words moved like music, slow and warm, not rushed, the kind of rhythm that rocks a thought to sleep. Boris appeared first, leaning against the doorframe. Brian followed, carrying the stuffed rabbit by one ear. Neither came close, not at first. But they listened. Florence turned a page, kept going. By the second chapter, Brian was at her side. By the third, Boris sat at her other. Still no words, just eyes tracking the story, fingers brushing the edge of a page like it might slip away. And then, a sound, a real one. Brian laughed, not loud, not forced, just a soft, startled breath that tumbled into a giggle when the story's character, a clumsy raccoon, fell into a barrel of honey. Florence didn't react. She didn't praise it, didn't freeze the moment with a smile too big. She just turned the page. Let the laughter sit there untouched. A few seconds later, Boris spoke. One word. Again. Florence looked at him, not surprised, just ready. So she turned back to the beginning. Greta passed the hallway just as the boys settled in again. She paused, just outside the door. She didn't step in, but her posture changed, not rigid, not cold, just unsure. Her eyes landed on the book in Florence's lap, the one Amanda used to read before bed, the one she'd packed away in a chest 2 weeks after the accident. "How did you—" she started to ask. Florence looked up. Calm. "It was in the linen closet, beneath the towels." Greta blinked. Amanda had folded it away herself. That book wasn't meant to be found. Not yet. Later that night, after the boys had fallen asleep, Florence placed the book on the bedside table. Not shelved, not hidden. Open. As if the story wasn't finished. Richard passed by the door again. He didn't enter, but he stood there for longer than usual, watching his sons, breathing in the stillness. And when he saw the book, Amanda's book, his jaw tightened just slightly, not from anger, from memory, from something he hadn't let himself feel. Florence didn't say goodnight. She didn't need to. The room was already full of the kind of peace that doesn't need words. She closed the door halfway behind her, left a sliver of light trailing in, and as she walked back down the hallway, her steps slow, even, careful. She didn't hear silence behind her anymore. She heard breathing, safe, steady, alive. The garden hadn't been touched since the funeral. Branches bent low with October weight, roses long past bloom. The ivy was creeping where it shouldn't, like the house had stopped caring what grew and what didn't. Florence was out early, no rake, no gloves, just a small pair of kitchen scissors, snipping quietly at dead stems near the path. Richard stepped outside with a cup of coffee he hadn't finished making. Shirt half-buttoned, eyes rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from months of pretending you're fine. He stopped at the edge of the porch, watched her work. "You're not hired to garden," he said, voice low. Florence didn't look up. "I know." Silence stretched. She cut another branch. Let the stem fall gently into the pile. "You used to have lavender here," she said. "I found dried sprigs in the kitchen drawer." Richard took a sip, then set the cup down. Amanda liked the smell. Florence stood, dusted off her hands. "I figured." He was about to turn away when she spoke again, softly. "You're running a company, but you're missing your boys." That stopped him. Not the words, the way she said them. No accusation, no pity, just truth. He crossed his arms. "They've got everything they need." Florence stepped closer. Not too close, just enough. "They had everything," she said. "Then they lost the one thing they trusted, and now they're watching you, wondering if they've lost you too." Richard's jaw tensed. He looked down at the coffee, then back at her. "You think I don't care?" "I think you don't know how to show it anymore." He didn't answer, not right away. Instead, he sat on the stone bench beneath the dying arbor and stared at the gravel between his feet. "My last words to Amanda were, 'Just go without me.'" Florence stayed still. "She wanted me to leave tech, build something quieter, something closer to the boys. We fought. She left angry." He looked up, eyes red. I was on a video call when it happened. She called from the car. I didn't answer. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was sacred. Florence stepped forward, knelt slightly, picked up one of the lavender sprigs she'd clipped. She held it out. "You don't have to be perfect," she said. "Just present." He took it, didn't thank her, but didn't let go either. That night Florence hummed softly outside as the boys drifted to sleep. Richard sat on the hallway floor back against the wall, lavender still in his hand. He didn't go in, didn't speak. He just listened to the quiet, to the hum, to his boys breathing in rhythm with a woman who had nothing to prove and everything to give. Greta had seen them all, the parade of polished women in perfect coats with laminated resumes and tight, sympathetic smiles. They arrived hopeful, left unraveling. The 8th one lasted 4 days. She'd come in with chore charts and sticker systems, talking like the boys were just waiting to be engaged. On day 1, she brought a puppet show. On day 2, she over-explained grief. By day 4, she stood outside the boys' room, crying into her sleeve, whispering, "They hate me." Greta didn't answer. She'd heard it before. What none of them understood, what none of them felt, was that this house didn't need noise. It needed space, and space couldn't be forced. Florence unnerved her from the start, not because she was loud, but because she wasn't. She didn't try to impress. She didn't narrate her every move. She didn't fill the silence with sugary voices or overcompensating smiles. She just observed. The boys weren't reacting out of fear or charm. They were responding to something Greta couldn't quite define, and that, more than anything, made her uneasy. That afternoon, Greta stood in the hallway as Florence passed with a basket of freshly folded towels. "The boys ate breakfast," Greta said, as if testing her. "I know," Florence replied. "They were quiet, but together." Greta narrowed her eyes. "They've been quiet since the funeral." Florence paused, then said gently, "Not all silence is the same." It was the way she said it, like someone who knew the difference. Greta waited until Florence was in the garden to check her room. She wasn't proud of it, but she'd seen enough to know when something feels too calm, it usually isn't. She expected clutter, notes, a tucked-away phone recording the boys, some secret reason this woman was so composed. Instead, she found a single suitcase, neatly packed, a Bible on the bedside table, and something else, tucked between the pages, a folded note, old, yellowed at the crease. Greta hesitated. She didn't mean to open it, but her fingers moved before her conscience caught up. Inside, in careful looping handwriting, "If something happens to me, promise me you'll let Florence find them." Signed, Amanda Oliver, dated 3 weeks before the accident. Greta stared at the page, then read it again. Downstairs, Florence hummed softly in the kitchen, laying out the boys' afternoon snack. No fanfare, no fuss, just a plate of toast, cut into stars. The boys hovered nearby, close but unhurried. Greta watched from the hallway, the letter still in her pocket, her breath shallow. She didn't understand what was happening. Not yet. But for the first time since Amanda died, she wondered if maybe this wasn't just another nanny, and maybe Florence hadn't arrived at all. Maybe she'd been sent. She didn't plan to show him, not yet. But that morning, the boys had followed her to the kitchen without being called. Brian helped set out napkins. Boris pointed silently to the bread he wanted toasted, star shapes again. They ate in quiet rhythm, shoulder to shoulder. Richard watched from the doorway, and for the first time he didn't look confused by it. He looked still. After breakfast, Florence walked past him in the hallway. He didn't move. "Florence," he said, almost under his breath. "Why are you really here?" She turned. Not startled, just ready. The library was empty. Dust danced through the beams of light slipping between heavy curtains. Florence sat on the edge of the leather armchair. She held the Bible in her lap like it weighed more than paper and ink. "I met Amanda once," she said. "Richard remained standing." It was at a grief retreat, she continued. My aunt ran it. Amanda came alone. She didn't speak much, but we talked. Not about pain, not directly, just about what it does to people. Florence opened the Bible, turned to the back cover. She unfolded the letter slowly, like she'd done it 1,000 times in her head. She wrote me this. She handed it to him without a word. Richard took the letter with careful hands. His eyes scanned it once, then again, slower. Her handwriting, her voice on the page. If something happens to me, promise me you'll find my boys. Signed. Dated. 3 weeks before she died. He looked up. You applied for the job because of this? No, Florence said. I didn't apply. I waited. His brow furrowed. I waited until I felt the door would open, she said. Until I wasn't coming in as a stranger, but as someone the boys would already recognize. You could have told me. You weren't ready. He sat down, hard, like something inside him had given out, or finally let go. Why her? He asked. Why would she ask you? Florence placed the Bible gently on the table. I don't know. Maybe she saw something familiar. Maybe she saw what I'd come from. She paused. I was raised by people who understood grief better than most. My aunt took in kids who had nowhere else to land. Quiet was something we learned to listen to. She folded her hands in her lap. I never came here for a job, Richard. I came because she asked me to. He didn't speak. Not for a long moment. Then, his voice low. I don't know how to forgive myself. Florence met his eyes. I'm not here to fix that. I'm just here. So they don't grow up thinking they were too much to love. The letter rested between them. Soft. Steady. A piece of Amanda's voice still echoing through a house that had tried so hard to forget the sound of her. Richard leaned back in the chair, the letter pressed to his chest, and for the first time since she arrived, Florence stood up without waiting for permission, because she didn't need it, not anymore. The birthday came with no cake, no party hats, no balloons, just a Tuesday morning, early October. The boys had turned 6. Florence had marked the date in her journal but said nothing. She knew not all anniversaries wanted to be celebrated. Some just needed to be survived. Still that morning she found Boris and Brian at the kitchen table with a pile of crayons between them. No arguing, no hiding, just colouring. Focused, determined. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't peek, just poured their juice, toasted their bread, sat nearby, let them have the moment without making it a performance. Later that evening, Richard stepped into his bathroom. Same routine, same dim light, same silence. Then he froze. There, taped to the mirror where he shaved every morning, was a folded sheet of construction paper, crayon lines, bold, unapologetic, 4 stick figures drawn side by side, 2 small, 1 tall, and one with a bun and an apron. They were in a park, holding hands. Above them, written in crooked yellow letters, "We're not alone anymore." He stared at it, not for a second, but for what felt like years. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out, not to take it down, just to touch it, to see if it was real. Florence passed the open doorway, pausing when she saw him standing there. She didn't speak. He turned toward her, holding the paper in both hands. "She didn't draw for months," he whispered. "Neither of them." Florence gave the faintest nod. They didn't need to. Until now. That night, after the boys had gone to bed, Richard handed Florence an envelope. Inside was a letter, typed, signed, an offer, Director of Family Integration Services, a new department, a new title, full benefits, a permanent role at the Oliver Foundation. Florence read it slowly, then folded it closed. "I'm honored," she said. But I didn't come here to build a department." Richard looked confused. "Then what do you want?" She looked up, calm, kind. "I came for them, not the role." He held her gaze, said nothing, just nodded. He understood. Later, she found the drawing taped above her bed, the same one from the mirror. One of the boys had quietly moved it. She smiled, ran a thumb gently over the yellow crayon. Not because she was proud, not because she was needed, but because she was home. Even if, just for now, she didn't live there anymore. Not full-time. Her things were gone. Her room, neatly packed and left spotless, as if she'd never been there at all. But the front porch still knew her steps, and the boys still watched for her shadow through the hallway windows every Friday afternoon. She came often, not because she was asked, because love doesn't wait for an invitation once it knows the way. That afternoon, the backyard smelled like cut grass and autumn sun. The boys were playing near the garden, Boris in a red hoodie, Brian barefoot in the grass, chasing leaves, laughter in their throats, real and full. Florence sat on the porch swing with a glass of sweet tea, her fingers tapping the rhythm of an old hymn on her knee. She was humming. She didn't even realize it. Brian ran up first, tiny sneakers thudding on the wooden steps. He held up a drawing, this one brighter, more color than line. 4 people, a house, a tree, and above it, scribbled in big, uneven letters, "Our family." Florence smiled, eyes soft. But before she could answer, Brian called out over his shoulder, "Mom, look!" The world stopped, just for a breath. Not because he said it loudly, but because he didn't correct himself. And neither did Boris, who came running up behind him with a toy plane in hand. And neither did Richard, who stood by the kitchen window and heard every word. He stepped outside. No suit, no tie, just jeans, a sweater, and a man who finally looked like he'd come home. He didn't say anything, just looked at Florence and smiled. She didn't correct the boys, didn't make it a moment. She just reached out, wrapped her arms around both of them and held on. Not like someone claiming anything, but like someone giving everything. Later, as the sun began to dip, Richard helped the boys clean up. Florence sat on the porch, the drawing now folded in her lap. She didn't need to frame it, didn't need to hang it on a wall. It was already where it belonged, in her chest, pressed between the quiet spaces where love settles deep. She never came to be called Mom. She came because someone once asked her to find 2 boys, and when she did, she gave them something no title could contain. She gave them back their father. She gave them back their laughter. And when they were ready, they gave her a name she never asked for, but one they knew she had earned.